Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 49 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. And Gavin, for however tired I may have sounded last week, I promise you, I'm even more tired now.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? And I might sound maybe a little bit different because I'm not in the blanket fort any
Yes,
longer.
where are you, Gavin?
I have escaped the blanket fort because I am back in my apartment. I have a nice couple weeks off. I have this week off and then next week off for Thanksgiving, which is really fun. And then I'll be back out to the desert after that. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So
Now,
for the time
did
being,
you plan that out? Did you plan out having like those 2 weeks off, or did it just randomly fall into your lap that way?
So I'd known for a little while that I'd had the week of Thanksgiving off, mostly just because the construction crew was not working Thanksgiving Day or the Friday or that weekend, and so I'd asked specifically for the Wednesday off, and my boss was like, "Hey, you can just take the whole week." It doesn't really make sense, especially for somebody who's not probably like the least local of all the people. Nobody like lives around there for our crew. But like there are some people who
there's
live
degrees.
Yeah, there are some people who live in LA, which is 3.5 to 4 hours away, as opposed to me, who's depending on traffic 7 to 8.
Jeez.
So they're like, yeah, it doesn't really make much sense for us to pay you to drive to the site for 2 days, pay for the hotel for 2 days, and then pay to drive home.
Right, they'd rather just have you stay. Yeah.
Right, and then I don't know if there was a weird scheduling thing, or maybe there's a problem with the hotel, but my boss basically said, hey, you, meaning me, and you, another paleontology person, she was like, so you're each getting a week off. One of you is going to be this week, one of you is going to be this other week. You two decide amongst yourselves who gets what. And so I asked him, like, hey, so I already have the week of Thanksgiving off. Do you mind if I get, because one of them was last week and then one of them was this week, meaning the week before Thanksgiving. So I was like, I already have the week of Thanksgiving off. Do you mind if I have the other week too, so that I have 2 weeks off in a row? He was like, yeah, absolutely. He's like, I mean, it's going to be the same pay for me either way. So it doesn't really matter.
I mean, that's a pretty good the way that worked out. The fact that
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you get those couple weeks off right there. If there's one thing I've learned about being a teacher is that getting a couple weeks off is nice.
Oh, yeah, man.
I don't know why some teachers get so defensive about that kind of thing. Like when you start bringing up summer break, teachers get all defensive. Man, summer break is the best. get 2 months off and I can do whatever. Yeah. Like, it is awesome.
Well, it is a good thing that you're relatively tired, because this is not going to be a heavy episode. This is going to be a quite light episode, actually.
Thank God. I wouldn't be able to handle it. You'd have a whole lot of from me during this episode if this was a... if we were going into the history of
the depth of something.
Yeah. If we were going to, the depth of the Marianas Trench or something, like, all right, I'm out. You can do this one yourself.
But yeah, so even though I am out of the blanket fort, I do not have the calendar with me. I've sort of given up on the calendar at this point.
I think that...
I think that's.
I was going to say I still hold out some hope for the calendar, but yeah, I don't hold.
We'll see. We may or may not be planning something for the calendar for toward the end of the year, but we'll see. So do you want to pull up
what the hell are we doing
this week in history, or do we just want to jump into it because it's relatively late and you're tired?
Oh, let's just jump into it, please.
All right. So today we're going to be talking about paleontology in the world of Pokemon.
Is this a real thing?
Because yes, it absolutely is. No, this is a real thing in the games. And yeah, I'm a big nerd, but we're going to be talking about it anyway because there's new games coming out this week, 2 days after this episode goes up, in fact. And they're remakes of games that came out when I was a kid, so I have a lot of nostalgia for them. And even though, paleontology in Pokemon is something that you can tell that like they kind of tried at, but didn't try that hard. So we're going to be talking about it today. So
they took someone that got a C in freshman year paleontology and was like, good enough.
Or somebody, the people at first didn't ask anybody, and then somebody who works there's kids got mad and were like, no, you got this wrong. And then they didn't make those mistakes again. So we'll talk about that. But so, Mike, what is your experience with this franchise? Did you ever play Pokemon as a kid?
So here's my deal, and I'm going to make you a little bit upset with this.
I mean,
But
I'm
so
sure we've
my
talked about this before.
I'm sure we have. So my parents were I was the oldest,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was real sheltered, and they didn't want me playing a whole lot of Pokemon stuff,
It what Pokemon
or anything
specifically?
along those lines. It, Pokemon specifically, but also anything that it was even like remotely violent. I had two cops as parents, and they
Oh,
tried to shelter me from all that. However, you can only do that so much. And my
yeah.
best friend, when I was in fourth grade, all my best friends were playing Yu-Gi-Oh,
Ah,
and so I got, and I still have somewhere in my house. Yu-Gi-Oh was the card game that I got into, and I
right.
know I had a few Pokemon cards eventually, but I never figured out how on earth it was supposed to work.
Yeah, still to this day, I don't even know how the card game works.
Right, and so I was a fan of Pokemon. I would like watch the TV show mostly because it came on right before Yu-Gi-Oh.
Ah, okay.
Um, but so I was a casual fan of Pokemon as a kid, but it didn't have the kind of generational impact on me that I know it had on a lot of other people our age.
Right, and especially I would say people maybe slightly older than us because we're both kids of like we were born in the mid '90s, so it's like
Right.
when Pokemon came out in the United States, I think in '98, at which time I was 2, and I think
Yeah,
it was
right.
even February of '98, so I don't even think I was 2 yet. So, and you were roughly 3, and
I mean, if it was
so
February of '98, I would have just freshly turned two because I'm a
oh
late
okay yeah,
'95 birthday.
so maybe not as much as it would have somebody like my older sister who was born in '92, uh but still it's not like they've stopped putting out Pokemon games, clearly, as we'll talk about. But yeah, Pokemon was something that I grew up loving, and yeah, I'm a big nerd. I still play Pokemon, sue me. um but yeah, like
For the
it's
record, that was Gavin Davidson. You can sue Gavin Davidson. You
yes, it
cannot
is.
sue me.
Yes. um so I went to this babysitter when I was a kid. Um, Mostly like during the summer because my parents work and stuff, and at that point my sister wasn't like really old enough yet to be responsible for both of us, and so my mom would take us to this babysitter who was also like a foster parent. So there was always just a ton of kids vaguely our age around, and they played some of like the relatively more recent Pokemon games, which were the second generation, which we'll talk about. Pokemon games Gold and Silver, as opposed to the first ones that came out, which were Red and Blue.
Hmm.
And being like nice older kids, they were like, "Hey, do you want to play?" And I was like, "A screen? Yeah." Just like every other kid today.
It doesn't take
And
much.
yeah, and so like it's only slightly an exaggeration to say that like I kind of learned how to read by playing
Hmm.
Pokemon.
I
Uh,
100% believe that.
so this is like a really big part of my life in a lot of the video games that I've played. So, and obviously being a scientist, they take some like glances at science a lot through Pokemon. Like if you're looking for things, you can find it, but it's kind of hard to be like, especially early on. It's kind of hard to be like, yeah, they did this intentionally.
You
um,
might accidentally come across something and then learn about it in actual science class like 7 years later, and just there's a spark in the back of your brain that it's like, huh, I feel like I've learned this before.
Not even so much that, but it's just like the early games. So,
Hmm.
we'll talk about this in a little bit, but there are different generations of Pokemon, and especially in the first couple, because they didn't intend for Pokemon to become the massive media franchise that it is.
Well, no
I
one ever
think,
intends that.
I mean, I feel like Nintendo knew what they were doing when they made Mario.
Did they? I mean, I don't know the history
Maybe they didn't intend for it to be Mario as we know it today, but they intended to only make Pokemon Red and Blue, and then Pokemon Gold and Silver, which were the Generation 2 games, and which are like
Hmm.
direct sequels, because that's the only time that they've really done that. The other
Okay.
times they're not sequels to each other. They're just kind
They're
of
just
in
standalones. Okay.
yeah. So they intended to only finish Pokemon after like the Game Boy Color.
Okay.
And you can tell because I think they started to take a lot more of like the world building sort of stuff a lot more seriously after that.
Right.
Um which we'll talk about. So, Pokemon fossils. Uh, yeah, there are fossil Pokemon in the
Okay.
sense that uh, Pokemon first came out in Japan in 1996. So this year is the 25th anniversary of Pokemon. And
Congrats.
very uncoincidentally, this was 3 years after Jurassic Park, the movie, came out.
So that kind of goes with, what you were saying before, just the impact that Jurassic Park had on, culture in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, being that Jurassic Park was so big and that the main plot point of it was they found fossils and then they revived, extinct organisms from them. That is a very... Pokemon does the same thing, just in a more simplified way.
Mm-hmm.
They don't ever explain how it works. You just hand scientist fossil. You literally, in every single game, if you hand it to them and then try to talk to them again, they'll be like, this takes a while. Come back later. If you literally just walk out of the room and come back in, it'll be done.
It's that simple.
Yep, it's that simple. So you hand scientist fossil, walk out of the room, immediately walk back in, talk to the same scientist. And they changed that in the later games where they will have a little cutscene to them walking into a back room or something, and then they'll come back out with the Pokemon, but just a freshly revived Pokemon for you. So again, very oversimplified version of what Jurassic Park did, but they absolutely got that from Jurassic Park. And so with Pokemon, like I said, they sort of break it up into generations. And so usually there's one main game in a generation, a whole bunch of different side games. And then occasionally they'll do a remake of an older one just because it's been a while. So the game that's coming out this week is a remake of the Generation 4 games, which came out on the Nintendo DS, the original DS.
Are they strictly remakes, or are they updates? Is it taking kind of the spirit of the old games but adding a new sheen to it, or is it just a money grab?
I mean, you can argue that it's a money grab, but it's not just a straight port of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of new quality of life features, because obviously going from the Nintendo DS to the Switch, which is what these ones are going to be on, is a lot different. But they've remade Generation 1, 2, 3, and now 4, because I think they try to do it every couple of console generations after,
right?
And so yeah, it definitely is a money grab because they know it'll sell. It's Pokemon.
I mean, okay.
But there are a lot of new, just quality of life things added. And so with Pokemon, the most recent not remake games that came out were Pokemon Sword and Shield, which came out in 2019, so about 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And that was Generation 8. So we are talk about generations 1 through 8, and most of them have fossils, but some of them don't, or at least new fossils. I think there's only 2 generations that don't have new ones, and they again never explain why. Especially because in one of them where they didn't have new ones, you could still find the old ones. So, whatever. So we're gonna go through each of the generations, talk about their fossils, and actually what animals they might have been based off of, and some stuff about the actual fossils themselves, where you find them, and that kind of thing. Just as a quick overview of Pokemon fossils. So, Generation 1 probably is the most famous ones, just because everything in the first generation it's the original.
First generation of anything.
Exactly. Well, it's where Pikachu is from. It's where Charizard is from.
Right. It's like rookie baseball cards.
Exactly. So we have first. Actually, I'm going to talk about where you get these fossils first, before I talk about the actual fossils. So there's an area in the game called Mount Moon, which is sort of the first cave type area that you come into. And at the end of it, sort of blocking your path is, in the original games, none of the trainers or NPCs that you fought had names. They just were a trainer class. So this guy whose trainer class is Super Nerd. Why, thank you.
I was gonna say.
And so he's sort of blocking your path, and there's these 2 fossils that you can see blocking your path. And he's like, no, these fossils are mine. And then He's like, okay, fine. I guess if you beat me in a battle, you can have one of them. And so you beat him, and you get to pick between one of two fossils. So the first one would be the Helix fossil, which,
Mm-hmm.
when you give that to the scientist, gives you the Pokemon Omanite, which evolves into Omastar. And if Omanite sounds familiar to a kind of fossil, uh, it is. It's because it's basically an ammonite, which we've described previously on the show before as the swirly shelled squid boys.
I remember the shelled squid boys. Oh
Yeah,
boy.
it's basically it's what by far one of the most common fossils that people are probably generally aware of, even if you don't actually know what it is. But it's basically just like a shell curled in on itself
Mm-hmm.
that a squid-like animal would come out of the front of.
And I'll tell you what, I got midway through saying swirly shelled squid boys before I realized how difficult that was to say, especially
Yeah.
when tired. That's a you would think that that's an obvious tongue twister, but you don't realize it until you're midway through.
Yeah. Uh, and so these are basically just ammonites, except for they a lot of like aquatic Pokemon, even if they're on land, they'll just kind of be shown floating. Yeah, as if they are swimming. But these ones are on the ground firmly. So I think in several of like the little information snippets you get about them throughout the games, uh, it talks about them being sort of bottom dwellers. So, but they use their tentacles to walk around like feet. And Amistar is basically just bigger. The evolved form is bigger with some spikes on the shells instead, which is not that. I don't know that has never been found on an ammonite, the actual fossils. It
Right, the real
would
ones.
Right. It would surprise. I had never heard of it, but they are an incredibly diverse group of fossils. So it wouldn't surprise me if there was like one or two with some kind of spikes on the shell, but I've never heard of it. So,
Hmm.
um, and we're also going to talk about some of like the in-game like information about them because some of it makes sense, most of it does not. And so with Omanite and Omastar, it suggests that they went extinct because they grew too heavy to be able to avoid predators.
Say that one more time. It went extinct because it got too heavy?
Right. So even though they were sort of bottom dwelling, I mean, if it lives in the water, like in the ocean, it can swim. Even if it's not great at it, if it's like a bottom dwelling thing, for the most part, it can swim to an extent. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but where all this information in the games is sort of an item that you get called the Pokedex. When you catch a Pokemon, it provides you with some information about the Pokemon. And so that says that it went extinct likely because they grew too heavy. They evolved to be too heavy to avoid their predators. Which, if that sounds weird, that's because it is, and that's not how evolution works.
Right.
So that would typically, I mean, in a roundabout way, that's like a maybe, but it wouldn't be that they evolved to be too heavy. It would that be other things evolved to be too fast.
Other things evolved to be too fast and
Right.
were
The
better able to.
things, yeah, the things that eat them
Mm-hmm.
evolved to be too fast for them to be able to avoid, and were like overhunted essentially.
So would this be an example of like survival of the fittest being actually what, scientists mean when that term gets used?
Yes and no. I mean, we talked a bit about in our episode about evolution that survival of the fittest isn't always the best way to sort
Right.
of discuss it because it's mostly just the survival of the good enough, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, so it would like yeah, something could go extinct because it is too slow. It is not because that thing evolved to be slower and heavier. It is because other things evolved to be faster.
Okay.
Things don't really evolve themselves into extinction. That's not how evolution works.
Right.
It
That's what I meant about like the other critters and everything. Like they were
mhm.
able to, you know, not necessarily the fittest, but like they were able to evolve in ways that probably allowed them to flourish more, and in
Right.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
process, extincted another species.
Yeah. Absolutely. And to my knowledge, there's no direct evidence of something besides humans. Big caveat. Hunting another species to extinction. Humans tend to do that quite often. Um,
Hmm.
but in the fossil record, I'm not saying it's impossible, but that's basically going to be impossible to tell from fossils by themselves.
Right.
Um, but anyway, the other fossil that you can choose. And the reason why it's called the helix fossil with Omanite and Omastar is because it is swirled. It's a swirled shell like a helix
Right.
that turns into these Pokemon. So the other fossil you could choose is the dome fossil, which can turn into Kabuto, which then evolves into Kabutops. So the dome fossil is basically just like a rounded dome, and that is because the Pokemon that you get from the fossil, Kabuto, is more or less a horseshoe crab without a tail.
A
So
horseshoe crab without. Okay.
yeah, if you don't know what a horseshoe crab is, look it up. They're really cool animals. They are
Are they the ones that have blue blood?
a lot of invertebrates have blue blood, but very famously, yeah,
Okay.
they horseshoe crabs do. They are sort of like the quintessential example of a living fossil, which we've talked about before too.
Right.
Where it's like you
Where
find
that's not a.
fossils, yeah, you find fossils of horseshoe crabs from like hundreds of millions of years ago, and they look very, very similar. Like if we saw one of those alive today, you probably wouldn't notice it sticking out too much from other horseshoe crabs.
Hmm.
Um, that doesn't mean that horseshoe crabs haven't evolved. That just means that hey, they're doing something that works.
Right.
Um, so that's what Kabuto, the first form, looks like. It's got some legs underneath, and then other than that, it's just a round, kind of brown, nondescript shell with a couple like black little eye spots on the top, like horseshoe crabs have. But when it evolves into Kabutops, it looks completely different because I think that Kabutops is supposed to be some kind of Eurypterid.
Is there a description anywhere, like on the official Pokemon website? Like, if you dig deep, like there's some guy that's like, "This is what I was smoking when I came up with." Like, this was the whole. Like, this was the thought process
Some of
behind
them.
why we did what we did.
Some of them. There's
Okay.
actually an exhibit. I don't know if it is still active. Um, but there was a traveling exhibit to all sorts of museums in Japan about Pokemon fossils. And with some of the Pokemon, especially like on the promotional material, it showed, a sort of 50-50 split up and down of Pokemon on one side and their fossil counterparts on the other.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it was really cool. And I wish that, obviously I don't read Japanese. And a
Not
lot of
yet.
it isn't translated super well. Um,
Not yet.
well, yeah. Uh, but uh, at least so they featured some fossil Pokemon like Kabuto, where Kabuto was on one side and then its mirror on the other side was a horseshoe crab. They didn't feature Kabutops, unfortunately, because it has some features of a trilobite, also very, very famous fossil creatures. Um, if you've seen something that looks like a bug that's a fossil, you're thinking of a trilobite. We can do a
Okay.
whole we'll have a whole episode about trilobites eventually, I'm sure. Extremely famous, extremely diverse group of fossils. But what I think Kabutops is more based on is a Eurypterid, which are also very famous
Hmm.
but less famous. Um, so this is a group that is normally called the sea scorpions. So they're only sort of like loosely related to like living scorpions, like land scorpions, but they look a lot alike. And this is actually New York State fossil, is a Eurypterid.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah. Um, and so it's got these big like scythes for arms, and then this
Right.
big sort of like almost boomerang shaped head, and it goes from being like like a horseshoe crab, on the ground, to being up and like bipedal with
Hmm.
like the big scythe arms. Sure. Um, and then this is one of the weirdly one of the Pokemon that we actually get like a skeleton of in the games, which if you're keeping track doesn't make any
Hmm.
sense because it should be an invertebrate and should not have
Is this
a
just a plot
skeleton.
hole that nobody cared about, or does this
Yeah,
actually wind up
absolutely.
making sense?
That's
Okay.
exactly why. It's because people were like, It was like in a museum in the original games, you like can interact with one of the exhibits in the museum, and it would be like, you know, a Kabutops skeleton from however many million years ago, and then show you a little tiny, you know, black and white 8-bit picture because it was on the original Game Boy,
Right.
and it was like not the Pokemon, but a skeleton of Kabutops, which it shouldn't have. Uh,
Hmm.
so that was somebody not thinking or paying attention, and just being like, "Hey, it'd be cool if, you know, museums have skeletons, right?" Uh, so, and speaking of museums, that brings us to our third fossil from Generation One, which is weird because this is the only generation until we get to Generation Eight, which we'll talk about, that has more than two different like fossil groups.
Oh.
Yeah, so this one is a fossil that you revive from an item called the Old Amber. You know, amber being the stuff that they get the DNA from in Jurassic Park.
Right.
So literally, this is like pure evidence that they just kind of copied this from Jurassic Park. Uh,
And why not?
right. And so you literally get this one not from that cave place. You get it from a scientist in the museum who's all hush hush. Is like, hey, I think this amber has DNA in it. Go take it to the lab in this other town to get it revived for me.
Hmm.
Sure. Um, so you revive it into the Pokemon Aerodactyl, who is a pterosaur, but a really interesting one in that. And yes, it's a Pokemon, but I always like to talk about this anytime media talks about pterosaurs. In that it has grabby feet,
So
which
it was able to pick up things with its feet.
yeah, absolutely.
Right.
In one of the episodes of the cartoon, it actually picks up Ash, the main character, and carries him around angrily for a while. Um,
Okay.
and so, as we talked about in our episode about pterosaurs, they couldn't do that. Their feet weren't structured that way. Their feet were much more like yours and mine than they were like a bird's. Um, but and it was basically like a big predatory pterosaur, and it's got these like big teeth on its bottom jaw, but no teeth on its top jaw. Its top jaw is much more like a beak.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and it has this long like dragon-like tail with like the little like triangle point, like devil point at the end of its tail.
Oh, geez, that is right out of a cartoon. Gee, like that's what a
Yeah.
child would draw.
Yep. I mean, there's a handful, not many, of pterosaurs that actually did have that.
Huh.
Um, most of them were not quite
Well,
like
good
a
for them.
nice triangle at the end like that. It was more of like a diamond or a spade shape. But they had some kind of like vein at the end of their tail like that.
Hmm.
Um, but how I kind of came to the conclusion of like, uh, they somebody's kid complained to them was because in the original information about Aerodactyl, it straight up called it a dinosaur.
Okay.
Right.
Just
And
okay.
so I'm sure somebody's kid or their niece or nephew was like, "Hey, that's not a dinosaur."
Yeah.
Um, and they only made that mistake in like the very first games and not afterward.
You only
So,
got to make that mistake once before you learn you don't have to do that,
yep,
and you can save yourself all the trouble.
exactly. Yeah, so that's all the Generation 1 games. Then in Generation 2, they didn't have any new fossil Pokemon, and you couldn't even I think you could like trade like somebody in the game something for some random Pokemon for an Aerodactyl.
Hmm.
But you had to trade over uh Omanite and Kabuto if you wanted them in your game. But then we get to Generation 3 when they started again taking some of like the more like lore things more seriously.
Right.
Um
They're
and I'm sorry
starting to
if you hear a dog in the background here, our dog is dreaming and she's making some sounds. So sorry.
Oh, is
Uh
she gonna start running at some point in her sleep?
no, she's never done that. She's just hanging out. She's just dreaming.
That's always
Uh
my favorite when dogs start running and then they wake up and they're very confused.
I mean, she's always kind of confused, realistically. Uh, but she's great. Anywho, so yeah, for the first generation of fossils, they're all given to you by some anonymous scientist man. Um, in Generation 3, you actually find them yourself, and that's kind of how it is going forward. So, Generation 3, you find them both. You basically have an option. You pretty much always have an option until a little later. I think there's 1 or 2 games where you don't. But in this game, you basically find them in the desert. There's a desert region of the game, and when you interact with one of them, it says, "This is the blank fossil," and if you take it, it looks like the sand will shift and the other one will disappear. And so, plot device, you only get one of them.
Mhm.
So the first one is the root fossil, which will give you Lilip, which evolves into Cradilly. And these are based off of crinoids, which are commonly called sea lilies, which makes them sound like they're plants, but they're not. they're
I, that
actually animals.
okay.
Even though, which is funny because they actually, Pokemon have types, right? All fossil Pokemon are rock types, with some exceptions that we'll talk about at the end. And they never explain, like, were these Pokemon rock types when they were alive, or like, are they rock types because they were a fossil, or what? Never really explained, even though people who are nerds like me talk about it. And so, but it's usually presumed that like their other type is like the type that they were when they were alive, at least. So, Lilip and Cradilly are grass types, which like further sort of is like, oh yeah, they must be plants. No, nope. Crinoids
Well,
are animals.
what do we do? I mean, like, if there's anyone that was going to be promoted of like words don't mean anything and this is all fake, it's me. But like, if words mean something, if words are going to mean something, then what are we
Yeah,
doing here?
yeah. So yeah, these are. So crinoids are
He
really
just
cool.
says yeah and then moves on. All right, okay. So
No,
this is how we're doing
words
this
are
episode.
important. Words are important, but
No, they're not. This is all fake. Everything we're
I'm
doing is fake. All
I'm
right.
trying to get you to bed, Mike.
I'm not going to bed tonight. What are you joking?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, crinoids are really interesting because they have it's basically a starfish on a stalk.
What do you mean a stalk?
So, most people have seen a starfish or sea star, right? And so it's got
No,
like
this is
the
Patrick.
exactly. So they've got well, the ones you're thinking of have 5 arms, right?
Yes.
There are many more that have lots of different number of arms, and so all of them have like the little suckers or like little tube feet on the bottom of the arms, and then the mouth like in the middle part. So basically, if you flipped it upside down so that the tube feet, little sucker things, were facing up, and then put like a long sort of stalk coming out of like the middle part of what would be its back.
This looks like a very odd tree in my head.
Pretty much. The arms in general were a lot thinner, so that it could be up off the seafloor. But
Mm-hmm.
they were like filter feeders, so they would use the little tube feet to like pluck stuff out of the water and then carry it down to the mouth, which was still like in the middle of, uh, the little branch area.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would hold themselves to like the seafloor with this thing that sort of looked like a root, but it's called a holdfast. Um, Basically, it's just something to anchor themselves there. They didn't actually absorb nutrients through it or anything like plants do with their roots. But that's why this is called the root fossil. Um, and so we still actually have crinoids around today. They're just much, much like less common than they used to be. Um, back, old, pretty much any time older than 250 or so million years ago, but between 550 or so to 250. So for like 300 million years, these were extremely common.
Mm-hmm.
Including, back in when I was still in New York doing some geology, we would find rocks entirely made out of these things. Just crazily common. And nowadays you can only find them on like the deepest part of like the like sea slope. So not like the like super super deep ocean, but like on the slope where it's like too deep for like things like corals to live, where it's like probably barely gets any sunlight, if any at all. So pretty deep water, whereas they used to be everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, That's Cradilly. And so the other fossil is the claw fossil, which is one of my favorite fossil Pokemon because that gives you the Pokemon Anorith, which evolves into Armaldo. So,
Armaldo.
yeah, Anorith is almost exactly just like a Pokemon version, cartoonified version of a really, really cool fossil animal called Anomalocaris.
That's a great name.
It really is. And I think it means like strange shrimp or something to that effect.
Okay.
Even though it's not really shrimp, it kind of superficially looks like one, but it's like back in the day, it was like, I don't have any clue what this thing is. I guess it kind of looks shrimpy.
Shrimpy
But
enough.
Anomalocaris was not like the first. There were ones before it, but one of the earliest, like absolutely dominant, like apex predators, basically to exist on Earth. So this is an animal from the Cambrian period, which is the first period where we have like a huge amount of like fairly good sized multicellular animal life. And this was one of the first things to be like swimming around, just chomping on, eating other stuff, which is
Right.
super cool.
Mm-hmm.
And so even like in terms of like size, this is basically the same size. It Anomalocaris is something that's I can't even describe really what it looks like
Okay.
because it is so foreign. A lot of the animals around at this time were really weird. This was like 540 million years ago, 520 maybe million years ago, and um, it basically has these two sort of arms almost in the front. I believe the technical like anatomical term for them is just frontal appendages.
Frontal appendage.
Yeah, so it's literally just like um imagine what like the tail end of like a shrimp or a prawn looks like, how it's got all those little like leg things in it.
Right.
So there's two of those coming off of it that have all those like kind of leg things in them, but instead of being used to swim, it used it to like scoop stuff into its mouth.
I mean, that
And
seems reasonable.
yeah, it doesn't swim using those are the only two like limbs that it has.
Okay.
And it's got these two eyes that kind of come out to the side like a hammerhead shark almost.
Hmm.
And it swims with these weird almost like wings on its side, but there's many of them in a row down the side, and it like undulates them, so like the front ones flap first and then the ones behind it, and so it's kind of like in like a pulsating motion. Very strange animal, but super cool. And the first form, Anorith, that evolves from this fossil, is literally just that. It's the frontal appendages are more like claws instead of what they are in Anomalocaris, but other than that, it's literally almost exactly the same.
So at this point, they know what they're doing, and they are, they've hired some paleontologists on the payroll.
Or at least on retainer.
Okay.
Well, I guess
They're hanging around.
yeah, until it evolves, because all of that just goes out the window when Anorith
Oh, really?
turns into Armaldo, and because Armaldo,
Armaldo.
right, great name, uh, and so like Kabuto and Kabutops, when Anorith evolves into Armaldo, it just grows back legs, then stands up on them for some reason. And
Okay.
the frontal appendage claws turn into like proper arms, not things coming off like the head, but like actually like a torso,
Right.
and just become big honking like not like scythe claws, but basically like if a crab claw was missing the bottom part, the part that closes, so it's just like sort of a slashy stabby claw
Right.
instead of like a grabby claw.
A slashy. I mean, that is like, it's almost like a horn, isn't it? Like, but
Kind
not
of,
on
yeah,
your
I
head.
guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good way to call it.
To call back previous episodes.
Yeah. But yeah, and like I love Anorith a lot because the animal that it's based off of is so cool, and then they just kind of throw it all out the window. Like there's some same themes, like the little like side wing things are still like on Armaldo, but they're just reduced and it doesn't use them to swim. And I mean, it's got legs that it stands on now, so it doesn't even need to swim. So that is Generation 3.
Generation 3. Okay.
Yep.
How many generations are there?
8 so far.
Okay.
We're going to go through the rest a little quicker. So
Okay, let's do it. So is there like, like the first two are real? Is this like when people talk about Weezer? Is it like, man, those first two albums are great, and then everything else was trash after that? Like, is this one of those where, there's a consensus among the hardcore fans that only up to a certain generation was any good?
It really depends when you started playing. People, for the most part, will be like, oh, I started with, Generation 1, and every other generation after that is trash. And, like, obviously, all of them have their upsides and their downsides.
Right.
For sure. But that's a whole other conversation that many people get very mad about for no reason.
I'm sure they do.
For no reason, because they're video games. But yeah, so with the Generation 4 now fossils, so the Generation 4 are the games that are being remade that come out this week. And so, as always with Pokemon, there are two versions. Originally there was Red and Blue. The games that are being remade are Diamond and Pearl. And to give them like different branding, they're now Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, because buzzwords. And so with this one, instead of giving you a choice like you had before, this one instead, one of them you can only get in one of the versions. The other one you can only get in the other version.
Okay.
And so, but similar to Generation 3, this is one that you actually find yourself, not just out in the desert somewhere. This is one, there's an area of the game just called the Underground.
Underground?
Yeah, you're in a system of like underground tunnels that sort of go under the entire like playable area of the game. Okay. And you can dig for stuff in the walls. And you can find different items, different usable things in the games, including these fossils. And so the first one, the one that is exclusive to Pokemon Diamond, is the Skull fossil, which gives you Cranidos and Rampardos, which are based on...
What fossil?
Skull.
Oh, Skull, okay.
Yep. And so these are based off of Pachycephalosaurs, which most people would probably know better as the headbutt dinosaurs.
Yes.
And so, again, basically just like a cartoonified version of them. They have like an extra, big domey skull with some spikes coming off the back. Although they make them actually weirdly predatory in these games. Even though Pachycephalosaurs, the actual animals, were herbivorous from everything that we can tell, the information that we get about these Pokemon is that they are very like aggressive, and talk about like how they like just completely destroy like their prey while they're hunting them. So it's interesting that they try to give them a little bit of like they really do in some of the later games try to build a little bit of like a paleo ecology and talk about how some of these Pokemon interact with each other in ways that just don't make sense. No. Okay. I like it from a world building perspective, but it's like if you're not going to do it right, don't do it. And we'll talk about that especially. We'll talk about that especially with the fossils from Generation 8 because they're very weird. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. So that is Cranidos and Rampardos. Again, just a little bit of like monsterified, cartoonified, like headbutt dinosaurs. So then in the other game, Pokemon Pearl, you get the Armor fossil, which gives you Shieldon and Bastiodon. So these are based off of Ceratopsians, which would be your Triceratops and friends. 4 legs, big, solid face. But for these two, instead of giving them horns and the frill, they just make their face like a shield. And so, especially with Bastiodon, it's body is relatively small and stout, and then its head is just a gigantic like square of like a shield. And this generation is really interesting because it's the first time they sort of do a theme with the fossils, sort of like the, you know, unstoppable force and immovable object sort of thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because so Rampardos for a very long time had like the highest attack stat of almost any Pokemon in the game. It was in the top 5 until like Generation 7, which was not at all the case. None of the other fossil Pokemon were like had anything spectacular about them.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just very strong offensively, and then Shieldon and Bastiodon, obviously being, you know, shields, are very strong defensively and have really good like defensive stats. So they had sort of a theme with them. And then these two were also the most closely related to each other, you know, at least the animals that they're based off of. Because the Pachycephalosaurs and Ceratopsians are fairly closely related. They share a most recent common ancestor with each other than they do with like any other group of dinosaurs. So they're fairly closely related, especially compared to like the other fossils that like show up together in Pokemon. So that's Generation 4, and the ones that are going to be the most prominent in the games coming out this week.
Okay.
We get to Generation 5. Generation 5 also is interesting because instead of they switch back to the giving you an option instead of a version
Making you choose. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first one is the cover fossil, which gives you Tortuga and Caracosta. These are basically ancient sea turtles, sort of. Very much like a very, very famous sea turtle from the Cretaceous period when things like T-Rex and such were around, which is called Archelon, which is, from everything I was able to find, the largest turtle ever. And so they're very much, at least the first form, Tortuga, which I'm pretty sure is just Spanish for turtle.
Oh.
Or I think it's not spelled the same, but it's pronounced the same.
Okay.
And basically just Tortuga is basically just a regular sea turtle, but much smaller and different color. Like its back, like the shell and its face are like a very dark blue or almost black color, and then its body and flippers are like blue. But other than that, it's an entirely normal sea turtle.
Right. Okay.
And then
Are we expecting Generation 5 to get re-released in a couple of years?
probably,
Like, would that follow the plan? Okay.
yeah, because they've remade every other, you know,
So there's no
Generation
reason
1
for
through
them not
4.
to do this.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Generation 5 are some of my favorite games, so I hope that they do. And so
What console did you play that on?
these were also on the DS.
Okay.
Yep. But so like they did with Kabuto and Anorith, when Tortuga evolves, it just stands on its back legs for no reason. Like it's still a turtle,
Oh.
it's still got a shell and like a beak face, and its front arms, like its flippers, basically just turn into like bigger, like almost like knuckle walking like an ape, sort of, but without any fingers. I don't know why. Not my favorite design. So, yeah, I don't know why they keep doing this when it doesn't make any sense. Like you could have just made like a bigger, cooler, spikier turtle or something.
You could have, but you didn't.
Exactly. And then the other fossil in Generation 5 comes from the plume fossil, which is a feather. And this gives you Arkin and Archeops, which are literally just more or less Archaeopteryx, the very famous first bird fossil. And that's basically just all they are, is like a very dinosaur-like bird. They don't have like a beak per se. They have more of a snout with teeth. They have like a longer tail with some feathers on it. So very much just a cartoonified version of a very early bird.
I wish we had like pictures in front just so I could like see all of these in front of me. And I suppose I could just Google them, but
Yeah.
it is just hearing you describe them is putting these incredibly odd images in my head. Are you doing this from memory, or do you have the pictures in front of you?
Oh my. With how much
Okay,
time
understood.
with how much time I've spent on these games, I can talk
Understood.
about pretty
Okay.
much any Pokemon from memory.
I shouldn't have even asked.
um, but yeah, so uh, this was actually a really cool reference because a lot of people don't know this, but the first ever fossil of Archaeopteryx was just a feather. It's Archaeopteryx is very famous for like there's one particular specimen that's called, I think, just the Berlin specimen is what that one's referred to. Um, but they found a fossil feather and we're like, oh, this is a lot older than we expected it to find any birds. So we're just going to call this Archaeopteryx, which means the first bird. As we've talked about before, though, a lot when things that don't get fossilized well are used in identification. That's probably
Right.
not great. Um,
Tends to be a bad idea.
yeah, so feathers don't tend to fossilize well at all, and so they had to like whenever you name a species, you have to have like a specimen that you designate as like the specimen. We've talked about it quite a few times on the show before, but it's called the holotype. And so for a while they were like, okay, well this feather, that's all it was a feather, and so
Right.
they were like, well, if this is the specimen that we're using, that's not very helpful. So
Yeah.
they sort of decommissioned that. It's still technically the holotype, but it's not the one people use as like the specimen anymore. But it's still a cool reference. So this is also sort of a theme that they had with Generation 5, like they had with Generation 4, in that both in the information that's given to you about both these turtles and these birds, they are supposed to be sort of the ancestor of all of the other turtle slash bird Pokemon in the games. Which
The
also,
ancestor of so
go ahead.
they released the ancestor in generation. Are we still in generation 5? Like
Yep.
what?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're fossils, so you find the fossils in the game and you take
Okay.
them to scientists and revive them. So
All right.
these are not Pokemon that you would find just out and about. And so you, in the information that it gives you, it says, Tortuga is the ancestor of all turtle Pokemon, which is not how evolution works also. Because it's like, yeah, okay, number one, it's a video game, so sure. Uh, but
Mm-hmm.
it is pretty much impossible to tell that, like, the very first ever turtle is this. Evolution just doesn't work nicely like that. We can almost never even tell that like this species evolved from this other species. I can only think of like 3 different things where that is something you could say with any kind of confidence, and it's 2 of them are regarding humans and horses, who we've mentioned we understand the evolution of more or less like perfectly.
Right.
Not perfectly, but as close as we're probably ever going to get.
To the first order of magnitude.
Right. So that's just, even though again that's cool information to have in the game, but if they had asked anybody who actually knows anything about science, they would have been like, maybe don't.
Would this be a dream job of yours, like to work on Pokemon and advise them?
Depending on how much I get paid, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess
I
that's
mean,
always the answer to that question.
it's Pokemon. A lot of people don't realize this. Pokemon is the largest media franchise in the world by a lot.
I feel like I heard that somewhere.
Yeah,
But
because
yeah,
it's. I mean, they have the games, they have the TV show, they have the Pokemon cards, they have all sorts of different
the
stuffed
movies.
animals and
I took
movies,
my
and
I took my day campers to go see Detective Pikachu a
yeah,
couple of years ago in the movie theaters. Like it's it really is. And you start thinking about like, they've
mm-hmm.
got their foot in every piece of media.
Yeah, literally everything. So that brings us to Generation 6, which also has some really good fossils. So another one where it sort of gives you an option. Although I think these ones are also given to you by a scientist man. Um, so we have the jaw fossil, which gives you Tyrunt that evolves into Tyrantrum. So they finally made a T-Rex Pokemon. It only took them, by this point, 10 years? 11
You
years, 12 years,
wonder,
somewhere in that range.
you wonder if there was like one guy there that had just been wanting to make a T-Rex the whole time, and
Yeah.
everybody just kept saying no, 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 until eventually they ran out of reasons to say no.
Yeah. I mean, there had been some T-Rex-like Pokemon that are not fossils. But
Mm-hmm.
someone was like, okay, fine. I guess you can do it. And it's even a dragon type, which is cool. Um, so I was
Yeah.
So Rex in Tyrannosaurus Rex means king. That is what it translates to. And so they sort of play on that motif quite a bit. The baby form Tyrunt basically is said to act like sort of like a spoiled toddler, as like a young like prince would be, I guess. Um, and then Tyrantrum, who literally just like straight up is like a T Rex, um, has sort of a crown of like spikes on its head, and also a sort of like a frilly collar made out of feathers, sort of.
Hmm.
And this is really interesting. This actually isn't my notes. This one is just straight off the noggin. In one of its like data entries, it even explicitly says how this Pokemon was revived might not be how it looked originally when it was alive, and that it might have actually been totally covered in feathers, which is really cool because that's something that I don't think scientists think that anymore, but that was something that was talked about quite a lot about T-Rex was, did it have feathers or like did it not? And I think the general consensus now is that it might have when it was a baby, but when it was an adult, probably not.
We're talking about the actual T-Rex here, not a Pokemon, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That was like a
Okay, okay.
real amount of like scientific discourse went around. Did T-Rex have feathers or not? And they
Yeah,
the
I
the,
just wanted
the
to make sure that we weren't talking about
yeah, yeah, yeah.
like, oh, the developers of Pokemon aren't sure whether or not the original Pokemon, had like I was gonna be like, come on, but okay, this is an actual
Well,
debate that is.
so they took influence from the real world debate, and in the data entries about the Pokemon said scientists think that this Pokemon was like resurrected incorrectly, and that originally, before it went extinct, did have feathers or may have had feathers. So they sort of take
Hmm.
that real world scientific discourse and put it in the games, which is chef's kiss. That was excellent. My little young paleontologist mind to read when I first played these games. Um, and then the other fossil that you get in these games is the sail fossil, which sounds like it would be something for like a Spinosaurus, right? That would make sense. T-Rex and Spinosaurus, Jurassic Park 3. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but no, this actually gives you the fossils Amora and Auroris, which are based off of the fossil sauropod, the long neck, long tail herbivorous ones, but specifically the genus Amargasaurus, which is really interesting because they have these big spikes. They have two rows of spikes going along their neck. And so for quite a while, people were like, I have no idea what this is used for. Could there have been like skin between these? And like it made like two sails, like a sail on each side of its neck for like display or something. That's not really what we think anymore. But that was something that was like sort of pitched around for a while. And so Pokemon sort of took that idea, basically made sauropod Pokemon with and these Pokemon are ice types, so they make the sails on each side like shimmery and make them look like the Northern Lights, which I think is really interesting. And another like sort of way that they took like a scientific controversy or something like to that effect and turn it into something really cool with the Pokemon. These are probably my favorites.
Anytime
uh
we get to talk about the Northern Lights, I'm in.
yeah, and it's like, and they change color based on what the Pokemon is doing. So normally they're kind of like a bluish color. If it's like attacking, they turn to like a more reddish color. They're really cool Pokemon. Generation 7 is the other generation that does not have any new fossils. you can find all of the other fossils, or most of the other fossils, but they don't have any new ones, and they just never explain why. And then we get to the weirdest fossils. And these are the most recent ones introduced in Generation 8. And so, in Generations 1 through 7, fossils were an item that you found, you took to scientist person, and they revived it for you, spit you back out a Pokemon. In Generation 8...
they changed everything.
Yeah. So, there are 4 fossil items that you can mix and match together.
Say that one more time. You can mix and match fossils?
Yes. So there are 2 top halves.
What does it even mean?
There are 2 top halves, and there are 2 lower halves. So you can mix a top half with a lower half, or you could mix that same top half with the other lower half, and you can mix and match the tops and the bottoms. So because there's 2 of each, that means that there are 4 possible combinations that you can make. And so there is some interesting references that this makes, because so the region, so each of the regions is based off of like a different real world place. I think Generations 1 through 4 were based off of different areas of Japan. This particular region was based off of the United Kingdom, which is where paleontology really got its start. And is also sort of where a lot of the early mistakes in paleontology were made, putting different things, different pieces of anatomy in places where they don't belong. And that's what this is sort of a reference to. It's also a little bit of
kind of cool.
Yeah, it's also a little bit of a reference to some things that might have happened in like the Bone Wars, to putting heads on the wrong ends of things, putting the wrong skull on the wrong body. So I get what they were going for. It just didn't really work well.
This seems like the product of too many meetings. It's like you have a bunch of meetings and somebody spits out like more customization, and there'll be a top and a bottom half, and you can flip flop, and it's like, and it's there could have been less meetings and a better product.
Yeah, and it's like, while I agree that this was not the best way to do fossil Pokemon, I really like these Pokemon just because they're so goofy. Because the top halves and bottom halves don't even look like they belong together, and that's what makes them really funny to me.
So is it basically like it's so bad it's good? Are we in that territory yet?
Yes.
Is this ironically good? All right.
Yes. And so I'm going to walk you through what each of the parts are, but this is one that I really suggest that you look up because they're so goofy.
Okay.
So the top halves are called the fossilized bird and the fossilized fish. The fossilized bird is actually much more like a dromaeosaur dinosaur, like a raptor, velociraptor and such. And the fish is actually the front half of a really cool ancient fish called Dunkleosteus. A really cool fish that was before fish had evolved teeth. So instead, it just turned the bone in its jaw really spiky and used spikes on its jaw as teeth. Super hardcore fish.
I think I've got the ones pulled up here. If I Googled this correctly, these are some weird looking, like...
Yeah.
What are we...
So, and then the bottom halves were called the fossilized drake and the fossilized dino. The fossilized drake... I should say, the fossilized bird translates to an electric type. None of these are rock types like every other fossil Pokemon was. All of them were rock and something else. These ones just mix and match the types. There's no rock type involved at all. And so the fossilized bird is electric type. The fossilized fish obviously is water. The fossilized drake, drake is in like Draco, it's dragon. The fossilized dino is ice type. The fossilized drake basically looks sort of like a stegosaurus like thing, where it's got these big like stout legs with some spikes going along at the back and toward the tail. And the fossilized dino is not actually a dinosaur. It's actually a purposeful mistranslation from Japanese. The original Japanese translates to fossilized plesiosaur,
Purposeful mistranslation.
Yes,
Okay.
but fossilized plesiosaur is too many letters for what they can fit in the English version, so they changed it to fossilized dino instead. So in the Japanese, it is correct. So it's the back half of a like a plesiosaur, like what that we talked about previously in episode 41, where they had sort of paddle back legs as aquatic reptiles. And you can make 4 fossil Pokemon out of them. You can make Arctozolt, who is combines the bird and the dino. So it's got basically it walks on land using like the flippers of like the back flippers of a plesiosaur as legs, so they walks around like it's got like clown shoes on because they're not meant for walking on land. And then it's got a bird head, or I guess like a velociraptor looking head and arms poking out of the top of it, because the bottom half is an ice type. It's got like snow on the top of it, so it's just a head and arms poking out of snow on a body that's too big and not meant for walking on land, but it does anyway.
Okay.
Then there is Arctovish, who is the fossilized fish and the fossilized dino. This is the one that looks the most right, probably. It's got the head of a fish and the back half of the plesiosaur. So at least it's in the water for both of them. But the head is on upside down, so the mouth is facing up. So it's just put on incorrectly.
It's just, I just don't get it, but okay.
Next is Dracozolt, who is the bird and the drake. And this one also looks relatively normal, except for obviously like from like the stomach up is much, much smaller than from like the waist down.
Mm-hmm.
And then my favorite is Dracovish, who is the fossilized fish and the fossilized drake. Instead of putting the fish head, where a head would belong, it puts it at the end of the tail and curls it up over the body.
Oh, I didn't even realize. Oh, good God.
Yep. It's a giant fish head on the end of the tail that then curls up over the legs.
That's a choice you can make. Okay.
Which is my favorite because it is so goofy. And the reason why I mentioned like the paleo ecology things is that because even though the game makes it explicit, these were not real like extinct Pokemon. This was something that like some weird scientist made. So it's not like these Pokemon were walking / swimming around back in the day. The information that it gives you about them completely contradicts that. In that with Dracovish, it says like, oh, this Pokemon's legs were built for running fast. However, it can't really do that because it can only breathe in water. So it's like it's good at running, but it can't because it will die.
I'm rather confused there.
So and all of them have things such as that. So it's like, again, very goofy, funny, and very charming from a science perspective. Obviously not really, which again is not at all the point. Right. It's a video game. But yeah, so those are all like the main fossil Pokemon. There are lots of others that have like inspiration from fossil things. Most of which are dinosaurs, just not fossil Pokemon that are just kind of around that take inspiration from things like dinosaurs. Other things like a Pokemon called Relicanth is more or less just a coelacanth, which we've talked about before, also in our Living Fossils episode. It's a type of fish that we thought was extinct until 1938, where we had only known them from fossils for, I think, around 100 years. We had named the fossil group before we knew that they were still alive. And so I think we knew about them from the early 1800s. And then somebody fished one up off of South Africa in the 1930s. And people were like, oh, this thing literally is a living fossil, So Relicanth is a rock type, but it is not a fossil. So that is very quickly, so Mike can get to sleep. The fossils of Pokemon.
And it is much appreciated. And this was a fun one, getting to do some fiction, and an odd blend of the real life and the fictional and your childhood, which was nice to do.
And I'm very excited for these games. they're going to be more or less games that I've already played several times over. But am I still going to buy them, or at least one of them?
Damn
Absolutely,
right.
absolutely, I am.
And this has been episode 49 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. Thank you, Gavin. I'll talk to you. Is it going to be the day before Thanksgiving next?
Absolutely, yeah, it is.
Oh boy, see you guys then.